Number 1.
We'd all like to think that people are capable of making positive changes, and many are. In the case of the Jack Unterweger aka the Vienna Strangler aka Jack the Writer, this was not the case. Released from prison following a murder conviction, Unterweger was considered completely rehabilitated from his violent urges of the past. Within a year, however, he would kill 11 more women, many of whom were prostitutes. A global manhunt to catch Unterweger ensued, culminating in a dramatic standoff with police. Johann Jack Unterweger's troubled relationship with prostitutes supposedly traces back to an early age. He was born in Graz, Austria in 1950. It was rumored that, in addition to being a barmaid, his mother also worked as a prostitute. She was arrested for fraud and was briefly imprisoned while she was pregnant with Unterweger. After her subsequent arrest in 1953, Unterweger was sent to live with his grandparents, as he never learned the identity of his father. During his early childhood, Unterweger began to commit petty crimes, which soon escalated into assaults of prostitutes in his area. Between the ages of 16 and 25, Unterweger was convicted of 16 crimes, most of which were sexual assaults. He spent the majority of these years in prison, only remaining free for months or even weeks at a time. In 1974, Unterweger committed his first murder. He killed a German citizen, 18-year-old Margaret Schaefer, by strangling her with her bra. He was convicted for the crime in 1976 and was sentenced to life in prison. When Unterweger confessed to the 1976 murder, he said that he had envisioned the victim as his mother, causing an intense rage to come over him. While Unterweger was in prison, he started writing. He wrote poems, short stories, plays, and eventually a widely successful autobiography called Purgatory. It became a bestseller, leading Austrian citizens to campaign for Unterweger's release, saying that his writing demonstrated his rehabilitation. Some schools even used his book as required reading. He was released after completing the minimum term for a life sentence in Austria, 15 years. After his release, Unterweger went on a national tour discussing his books on various television and radio shows. He was a celebrity in Austria. He bought a Ford Mustang and donned designer clothing for his press tour. He became a working journalist and reporter, and he even reported on later murders that he committed. His first post-prison murder was that of Blanka Bukova. Her body was found floating in the Vltava River near Prague, Czech Republic. Her body was found covered in leaves with a set of gray stockings tied around her neck. Friends had seen her the previous night getting drinks. When they left shortly before midnight, they noted that Bukova was talking to a man in his 40s. A few weeks later, a well-known sex worker in Unterweger's hometown went missing. Her body was found several months later, and she was killed the same way as Bukova. A third woman, Heide Mary Hammerer, was killed shortly after the others. She was found on her back, also covered in leaves. All three were strangled either with their bras or stockings. The fourth woman Unterweger killed was different. She too was a sex worker, but Unterweger took a different approach in the days leading up to her killing. He called her parents a few times beforehand, and he taunted them about how their daughter earned her living. Her corpse was found 6 months later. She, like the three previous victims, was also found with lingerie around her neck. 4 more prostitutes who worked in Vienna went missing within 1 month of each other. They were all strangled with an article of their own clothes. It was clear to the Austrian police now that they were dealing with a dangerous serial killer. August Schenner was 70 years old at the time of the slayings. He was a retired investigator who told the Austrian police that the circumstances of prostitutes' deaths reminded him of a killer he had caught nearly 20 years older. That killer was none other than Jack Unterweger. As police began to close in on him, Unterweger was hired by an Austrian magazine to write an article on crime and law. It focused on the differences between the Austrian and American perceptions of prostitution. While on his trip to Los Angeles, Unterweger went on ride-alongs with the LAPD and gave them insight on catching killers. While seemingly assisting the LAPD, Unterweger also found the time to kill 3 more women. Each woman was sexually assaulted with tree branches and strangled with their own bras. He went to Miami with his girlfriend, even as the Austrian police collected evidence to prove that Unterweger was the killer. The pair went to collect wired money from a Western Union bank, where the police were waiting nearby to arrest him, proclaiming his innocence. Unterweger spoke to the Austrian media to try to convince viewers he was not the murderer. But this time, the Austrian people were not in Unterweger's corner. He was extradited to Austria, where he would be tried for 11 homicides. He was found guilty of 9 of these murders, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Unterweger only served 1 night of his prison sentence. He committed suicide the night of his sentencing with a rope he made out of his prison uniform. The knot was the same kind he had used to kill his victims. Because Unterweger never had the time to appeal his conviction, under Austrian law, he is technically considered to be not guilty, as his verdict was not yet legally binding. The man known as the Vienna Strangler eluded capture for years, all while he was right under their noses, on their radios, and in their newspapers.
Number 2.
Mario Alberto Sulu Canche. Mario Alberto Sulu Canche, a Mexican serial killer and rapist also known as Mario Alberto Sulu Canche. Sulu raped and killed 3 women from 2007 to 2008. He strangled at least one of his victims and struck another victim with a log. Sulu disposed of the 3 bodies using 3 separate methods: burning, burying and throwing one body in the sea. In 2008, Mario Alberto Sulu Canche committing suicide by hanging himself with a pair of his own pants in a bathroom area at the Federal Social Rehabilitation Center No. 1, also known as Altiplano in Mexico. Joaquin Guzman Lara, better known as El Chapo, a Mexican drug lord and former leader of the Sinaloa cartel, escaped from Altiplano in 2015. Serial killer Mario Alberto Sulu Canche, aka Mario Alberto Sulu Canche, was active for 2 years between 2007 to 2008, known to have 3 confirmed 3 possible victims. This serial killer was active in the following countries: Mexico. Mario Alberto Sulu Canche, a male citizen of Mexico. Prior to his spree he had committed crimes and served time in jail. In 2007 Mario Alberto Sulu Canche started his killing spree. During his crimes as a serial killer he was known to strangle, rape, mutilate, and murder his victims. He was arrested on August 4, 2008, sentenced to 40 years in prison at the Federal Social Rehabilitation Center No. 1, Altiplano in Mexico. He was convicted on charges of murder and other possible charges during his lifetime. Mario Alberto Sulu Canche died on August 28, 2008. Cause of death: suicide. Committed suicide by hanging himself at the Federal Social Rehabilitation Center No. 1, Altiplano in Mexico. Mario Alberto Sulu Canche committed suicide on August 28, 2008.
Number 3.
In December 1924, a young homeless man reported to the German police in Silesia that he had narrowly escaped from a madman who attempted to kill him with a pickaxe. When officers went to the address at No. 10 Teichstrasse and arrested a 64-year-old butcher named Karl Denke, they believed they had the wrong man. Well known to local residents, who knew him as Papa Denke, when questioned the suspect claimed he merely attacked Vincenz Olivier in self-defense. Denke was placed in a cell where 2 days later he inexplicably hanged himself. Now with concerning questions about why the respectable prisoner would commit suicide, detectives decided to search Denke's apartment, where to their shock, they discovered a large amount of human body parts and bones kept in storage. The murderer had also kept a detailed ledger containing the names of his victims, and it was strongly believed he had been eating the flesh of the people he murdered. Known as the Cannibal of Munsterberg or the Zeebek Cannibal, it was believed Denke had been responsible for the murders of upwards of 31 people, and possibly even more abhorrent, that he had been selling the human meat at his butcher's shop for decades to the unsuspecting people of Munsterberg. Karl Denke was born on August 12, 1860 in Kunzendorf, Silesia in the Kingdom of Prussia. He was a difficult child to raise according to his parents, who had several children and ran a nursery, and would later say that as a small child, Karl refused to speak to anyone until the age of 7. He was known as a soft and quietly spoken child, but around the age of 12, he began to run away from the Denke farmhouse, and was always brought back by police. Upon graduating from elementary school, he became an apprentice gardener, and made a comfortable life for himself by the age of 25. When his father died, His older brother inherited their childhood home, and Denke received a portion of the money, which he used to purchase a piece of land. His attempt at farming failed. He sold the land. He then bought a house on what is now called Stowa Street in Katowice, but inflation forced him to sell it. But Denke refused to move out, and instead lived in a small apartment to the right of the house's ground floor. He also ran a nearby shop from where he sold meat at the Wroclaw weekly market, the source of which would later be investigated by police. At the time, Denke always declared the meat to be goat flesh. In 1880, he moved to the city of Munsterberg and began renting an apartment at 0.10 Teichstrasse, which was owned jointly by the Voigt and Gabriel families. It was said that although he was well-liked in the community, he had little interaction with his co-tenants. He worked occasionally as an organ player at the local church, and was known affectionately by those within the community as Vader Denke Papa Denke. On February 21, 1903, a young German woman, Ida Lohner, went missing. It would be Denke's first recorded murder, and he was never suspected of the crime, and went on to claim many more victims throughout the following years, mostly homeless vagrants or poor travelers. By 1906, Denke had quit his membership with the church. He would go on to murder 25-year-old Emma Sander on December 21, 1909, a crime for which another man was sentenced. Butcher Edward Trotman was arrested in 1910 on suspicion of Sander's murder, because he had previously solicited the young woman and had been seen in her company prior to her death. In 1911, he was found guilty and sentenced to 15 years in Glatz prison. Denke's murderous spree continued up until December 20, 1924, when he approached a young homeless man named Vincenz Olivier. He requested 35-year-old Olivier's help in drafting a letter, for which he would pay him. When Olivier began to write the letter under Denke's dictation, it began with the words, "Adolf, you fatty," which caused Olivier to begin laughing. As he turned his head to the side, Denke suddenly hit him in the head with a pickaxe, wounding his scalp, but not killing him. At that moment, a coachman by the name of Gabriel heard cries for help, which seemed to be coming from Denke's lodgings. As Gabriel rushed down to help, he found Olivier staggering along the corridor with blood streaming from his open wound. Before falling unconscious on the ground, the young man blurted out Vader Denke had attacked him with an axe. Gabriel soon alerted the authorities, and Denke was arrested and questioned about the incident. He admitted attacking Olivier, but claimed he was merely defending his property from what he believed was an unknown burglar. Officers placed him in a holding cell, where, according to police, just 2 days later he hanged himself with some type of ligature he fashioned. Detectives now wondered why such a respected member of the community would kill himself over what seemed to be a misunderstanding. When officers were dispatched to Denke's house, they found a gruesome collection of human body parts, which had been stored in his home. There appeared to be numerous victims along with evidence of cannibalism, such as jars of pickled meat, as well as many blood-stained clothing hung up in his closet, and it looked like Denke had been murdering transients and homeless people for many years. The pickled meat was sent to chemists at Wroclaw, who declared it human flesh. A ledger was found at his home which contained the names and details of his many crimes, with at least 31 victims recorded by Denke. The names of his many victims included Heinrich Bruchmann, a carpenter from Kammerswaldau killed on February 2, 1914, a railroader from Reumen named Nebel murdered on January 8, 1919, and Caspar Hubelek, who was dispatched on April 20, 1924. Many more were listed, such as laborer Franz Neis, tailors Johann Kloss, Ewald Koenig and Johann Groger, a butcher by the name of Robert Lorenz, farmers Karl Seidel and Emil Exner, weaver Joseph Nierlich, confectioner Adolf Salisch, Arner Hermann Kaschinki, and workers Paul Lux, Oscar Heinzel and Wilhelm Rathmann. Amongst the names were 2 bakers Julius Busch and Friedrich Lazina, as well as painter Karl Becker, a locksmith by the name of Hermann Muller and Max Heidenreich, who had been a blacksmith. His youngest victim was just 16-year-old and oldest at 76. The 31st and last known victim was named Rochus Pollock, a Breslau fur dealer who was murdered on November 17, 1924. Despite Denke's detailed records, Police came to believe there were even more victims unaccounted for, especially considering the large number of body parts found at his home, with estimates as high as 42 or even more. A detailed police report of the remains found at Denke's house included 2 shoulder blades, a pair of collarbones, 16 femurs, of which 1 pair of remarkably strong ones, 2 pairs of very thin ones, 6 pairs and 2 left femurs, 15 medium-sized pieces of long bones, 4 pairs of elbow bones, 7 heads of radii, 9 lower parts of radii, 8 lower parts of the elbow, a pair of upper shin bone, a pair of lower elbows and radii, of which extremities still remain well connected, a pair of upper arms and a pair of upper arm heads, 8 heels and ankle bones, 120 toes and phalanx, 65 feet and metacarpal bones, and 5 first ribs and 150 pieces of ribs. Police also found the pickaxe Denke had used to attack Olivier, as well as several knives that might have been murder weapons, and a saw the killer used to dismember the bodies of his victims. The subsequent police investigation found that Denke had obtained permission from city officials to sell shoelaces door to door, which had been made from the processed human hair of his victims. Detectives also discovered 2 previous victims had escaped, but never reported it to the authorities. Edward Trotman, the butcher imprisonment for the murder of Emma Sander, had previously been released in 1922 for good behavior, and was now, with the contents of Denke's ledger revealing his victims, exonerated over the death of the young woman, and he later sued for damages in 1925. Some residents now remembered Denke operated a shop from where he sold meat, and soon people suspected it possible the killer may have sold human flesh to the unsuspecting patrons of the Wroclaw weekly market. The case of Karl Denke had been largely forgotten to history, until the wooden shed in Denke's garden was destroyed after World War II, and several skulls and human bones were unearthed by the new Polish owners of the house. Although much of his life and the motive for his crimes remain a mystery, the residents of Zebus, as the village is known today, remember the case of Karl Denke, the cannibal from Munsterberg.
Number 4.
Jeanne Weber was a French serial killer who strangled at least 10 children, including her own. She was both convicted of murder and declared insane in 1908, and hanged herself 2 years later. Born in a small fishing village in northern France on the 7th of October 1874, Weber left home for Paris at the age of 14, working various menial jobs until her marriage in 1893. Her husband, however, was an alcoholic, and 2 of their 3 children died in 1905. By then, Jeanne Weber was herself drinking heavily, residing in a seedy Paris tenement with her spouse and her 7-year-old son. On 2 March 1905, Weber was babysitting for her sister-in-law, when one of the woman's 2 daughters, 18-month-old Georgette, suddenly fell ill and died. Strange bruises on her neck were ignored by the examining physician, and Weber was welcomed back to babysit on 11 March. 2-year-old Suzanne did not survive the visit, but a doctor blamed the second death on unexplained convulsions. When babysitting for her brother, on 25 March, his daughter, 7-year-old Germaine, suffered a sudden attack of choking, complete with red marks on her throat. The child, however, survived that episode, but she was less fortunate the following day, when Weber returned and killed her. Diphtheria was blamed for her death and for that of Weber's son, Marcel, just 4 days later. Once again, the telltale marks of strangulation were ignored. On April 5, 1905, Weber invited 2 of her sisters-in-laws to dinner, and remained home with her 10-year-old nephew Maurice. While the other women went out shopping, they returned prematurely to find Maurice gasping on the bed, his throat mottled with bruises, Jeanne standing over him with a crazed expression on her face. Charges were filed, and Weber's trial opened on 29 January 1906, with the prosecution alleging 8 murders, including all 3 of Weber's own children and 2 others, Lucia Linder and Marcel Poyatos, who had also both died while in her care. And it was further alleged that Weber killed her son in March, in order to deflect suspicion off herself. Weber was, however, being defended by the brilliant defense lawyer Henry Robert, and jurors were reluctant to believe the worst about a grieving mother. She was acquitted on 6 February. 14 months later, on 7 April 1907, a physician from the town of Villedieu was summoned to the home of a peasant named Bavauzet. He was greeted at the door by a babysitter, Madame Malinet, who led him to the cot where 9-year-old Auguste Bavauzet lay dead, his throat badly bruised. The cause of death was listed as convulsions, but the doctor changed his opinion on 4 May, when Madame Malinet was identified as Jeanne Weber. Weber engaged the lawyer Henry Robert once more. Held over for trial, Weber was released in December, after a second autopsy blamed the boy's death on typhoid. Weber quickly dropped from sight, surfacing next as an orderly at a children's hospital in Fauconbald. Moving on from there to the children's home in Orgeville, run by friends who sought to make up for the wrongs that justice has inflicted upon an innocent woman. Working as Marie Lemoyne, Weber had only been employed in the job for less than a week when she was caught strangling a child in the home. The owners quietly dismissed her, and the incident was covered up. Back in Paris, Weber was arrested for vagrancy and briefly confined to the asylum at Nanterre. Doctors there pronounced her sane and set her free. She drifted into prostitution, picking up a common-law husband along the way. On May 8, 1908, the couple settled at an inn in Commercy. A short time later, Weber was found strangling the innkeeper's son, 10-year-old Marcel Poirot, with a bloody handkerchief. The father had to punch her 3 times in the face before she would release the lifeless body. Jeanne Weber's real name only became known after she had been arrested and placed in a cell. The authorities made quick haste to bring her to trial as soon as possible. Held for trial on murder charges, Weber was declared insane on October 25, 1908, and sent to the asylum at Merville, credited with at least 10 murders. She only survived 2 years in captivity, before hanging herself in her cell on the 5th July 1910. At the age of 35, he admitted attacking Olivier, but claimed he was merely defending his property from what he believed was an unknown burglar. Officers placed him in a holding cell, where, according to police, just 2 days later he hanged himself with some type of ligature he fashioned. Detectives now wondered why such a respected member of the community would kill himself over what seemed to be a misunderstanding. When officers were dispatched to Denke's house, they found a gruesome collection of human body parts, which had been stored in his home. There appeared to be numerous victims along with evidence of cannibalism, such as jars of pickled meat, as well as many blood-stained clothing hung up in his closet. And it looked like Denke had been murdering transients and homeless people for many years. The pickled meat was sent to chemists at Roquelaure, who declared it human flesh. A ledger was found at his home which contained the names and details of his many crimes, with at least 31 victims recorded by Denke. The names of his many victims included Heinrich Bruchmann, a carpenter from Kammerswaldau killed on February 2, 1914, a railroader from Reumen named Nebel murdered on January 8, 1919, and Caspar Hubelek, who was dispatched on April 20, 1924. Many more were listed, such as laborer Franz Neis, tailors Johann Kloss, Ewald Koenig and Johann Groger, a butcher by the name of Robert Lorenz, farmers Karl Seidel and Emil Exner, weaver Joseph Nierlich, confectioner Adolf Salisch, Arner Hermann Kaschinki, and workers Paul Lux, Oscar Heinzel and Wilhelm Rathmann. Amongst the names were 2 bakers Julius Busch and Friedrich Lazina, as well as painter Karl Becker, a locksmith by the name of Hermann Muller and Max Heidenreich, who had been a blacksmith. His youngest victim was just 16-year-old and oldest at 76. The 31st and last known victim was named Rochus Pollock, a Breslau fur dealer who was murdered on November 17, 1924. Despite Denke's detailed records, police came to believe there were even more victims unaccounted for, especially considering the large number of body parts found at his home, with estimates as high as 42 or even more. A detailed police report of the remains found at Denke's house included. The subsequent police investigation found that Denke had obtained permission from city officials to sell shoelaces door to door, which had been made from the processed human hair of his victims. Detectives also discovered 2 previous victims had escaped, but never reported it to the authorities. Edward Trotman, the butcher imprisonment for the murder of Emma Sander, had previously been released in 1922 for good behavior, and was now, with the contents of Denke's ledger revealing his victims exonerated over the death of the young woman, and he later sued for damages in 1925. Some residents now remembered Denke operated a shop from where he sold meat, and soon people suspected it possible the killer may have sold human flesh to the unsuspecting patrons of the Wroclaw weekly market. The case of Karl Denke had been largely forgotten to history, until the wooden shed in Denke's garden was destroyed after World War II, and several skulls and human bones were unearthed by the new Polish owners of the house. Although much of his life and the motive for his crimes remain a mystery, the residents of Zebus, as the village is known today, remember the case of Karl Denke, the cannibal from Munsterberg.
Number 5.
Harold Shipman, also known as Harold Frederick Shipman, is one of the most active serial killers of the modern period. On January 31, 2000, a jury found Shipman guilty of killing 15 patients. While they were under his care, he received a life sentence with a lifelong restriction. On January 13, 2004, the day before turning 58, Shipman killed himself in his cell in the West Yorkshire-based HM prison Wakefield. Despite the fact that other doctors have been cleared of comparable crimes or found guilty of less serious offenses, Shipman is the only British doctor to date to have been found guilty of killing his patients. On January 14, 1946, Harold Frederick Shipman, also known as Fred, was born into a middle-class household as the middle child. He quickly became the darling of his controlling mother Vera. Harold Shipman, a British serial killer, attended Leeds School of Medicine and started practicing medicine in 1970. He administered deadly amounts of medications to his patients, killing at least 215, and potentially as many as 260 of them between that time and his arrest in 1998. He volunteered to manage his mother's care when she was told she had lung cancer, which was terminal. After being devastated by her passing, he was determined to attend medical school. 2 years after failing his admission examinations for the first time and before completing his hospital internship, he was admitted to Leeds University Medical School for training. He was still an introvert when he met Primrose, the woman who would become his wife. He got married to him at the age of 19, while Primrose was 17 and 5 months pregnant with their first child. He entered medical practice in Tydmorden, Yorkshire, in 1974, by then a father of 2, and initially flourished there as a family doctor, until allegedly developing a pethidine addiction. The young doctor was caught forging prescriptions for Demerol, an opioid frequently used to treat severe pain. Shipman now needed help. He received a fine, lost his job, and had to go to a rehabilitation center in York. In 1977, Harold Shipman appeared to bounce back fast, and went back to work at the Donnybrook Medical Center in Hyde. He would work here for the following 15 years of his career, before starting a solo practice in 1993. He earned a reputation as a caring and competent doctor among his patients and in his neighborhood. His bedside manner was well known. What were his ways of killing patients? How did it all start? Shipman saw 70-year-old Eva Lyons as his first patient in March 1975, and her birthday was the following day. Investigators said that throughout Shipman's long period of terror, his killing spree was frequently interrupted and then resumed. But he always used the same deadly technique. He would prey on the weak, with Peter Lewis, 41, his youngest victim, and Ann Cooper, 93, his oldest. Then he would either watch them die there or send them home to die after giving them a deadly dose of diamorphine. He is thought to have killed a total of 71 patients while working at the Donnybrook Clinic, and the remaining victims while running his solo business. 44 men and 171 women were among his victims. The local mortician noticed that Dr. Shipman's patients appeared to be passing away at an exceptionally rapid rate, and took on identical positions as they passed away. The majority were fully dressed and frequently sat up or reclined on a couch. In 1998, the number of Shipman's patients who passed away led to suspicion among the local funeral directors in Hyde. The nearby medical practice afterward found out that his patient's death rate was about 10 times higher than the other doctors operating in that area. They voiced their worries to the local coroner, who subsequently made a call to Greater Manchester Police. This might have signaled the end of Shipman's horror, but it didn't. The police inquiry lacked the most fundamental inspections, such as a background check on Shipman. Despite a subsequent clandestine inquiry, Shipman was found not guilty since his records seemed accurate. The investigation omitted contacting the General Medical Council, or to look up criminal histories, which might have revealed information about Shipman's prior behavior. Later, a more thorough examination revealed that Shipman tampered with his patients' medical records to support the causes of their deaths. In the death certificates, Shipman always listed natural causes as the cause of death. His atrocities have always been committed for unknown reasons. It is nearly impossible to determine when Shipman started killing his patients, or even how many perished at his hands, because he was hiding behind his reputation as a kind family doctor. His denial of all claims also did little to help law enforcement. His murderous rampage was actually only put to an end by the tenacity of Angela Woodruff, the daughter of one of his victims. She would not accept the justifications given for her mother's passing. A 2002 study stated that he started killing around 1975, after he made the error of attempting to fake the will of 81-year-old Kathleen Grundy, a former mayor of his town of Hyde. Shipman's crimes were ultimately discovered. Grundy received a fatal dose of diamorphine from Shipman, who then checked the cremation box on her will to conceal the evidence. He then modified the will using his typewriter to exclude her relatives and leave everything to himself altogether. Grundy was buried, nevertheless, and local attorneys informed her daughter, Angela Woodruff, about the will. She immediately suspected wrongdoing and called the police. Following the exhumation of Grundy's body in August 1998, diamorphine was discovered in her muscle tissues. Another 11 victims' bodies were exhumed over the course of the following 2 months. A police specialist also examined Shipman's medical office computer and found that he had generated bogus entries to substantiate the fabricated causes of death he claimed on the death certificates of his victims. At the same time, Shipman argued, citing his notes as proof, that Grundy was dependent on a substance like morphine or heroin. Police discovered that Shipman had created the notes on his computer following her passing. Police were able to confirm 14 further instances in which Shipman had administered deadly amounts of diamorphine, falsely recorded the patients' deaths, and altered their medical records to indicate that they were already dying. Harold Shipman consistently refuted the murders and resisted cooperating with investigators or forensic psychologists. He sat with his eyes closed, yawned, and wouldn't look at any evidence when the police tried to question him or show him pictures of his victims. Police could only bring 15 murder charges against Shipman, although it is believed that he has killed between 250 and 450 people. On September 9, 1998, Harold Shipman was taken into custody. When the police searched his residence, they discovered an odd collection of jewels, as well as an ancient typewriter that he had used to carry out. The police realized during the inquiry that the case involved more than one death. Police compiled a list of 15 sample cases to look into. They eventually identified Shipman's habit of killing individuals with lethal amounts of diamorphine, and then falsified their medical records to indicate that they were ill. Shipman refused to admit guilt, despite the overwhelming evidence against him. His wife continued to insist that he was not guilty. Shipman's trial commenced on October 5, 1999, and on January 31, 2000, the jury returned a verdict finding him guilty of 15 murders and 1 forgery. It was suggested that he never be released after receiving a life sentence. His name was removed from the General Medical Council register 10 days following his conviction. Several changes to British conventional medical practice were undertaken as a result of the Shipman case. Rules for death certification were also changed. Shipman was given a life sentence in jail in 2000, with the suggestion that he never be freed. He was jailed in a Manchester facility, but was transferred to Wakefield Prison in West Yorkshire, where he committed suicide. Shipman was discovered hanged in his cell on January 13, 2004, the day before he turned 58.
Number 6.
Notorious serial killer John Wayne Glover committed at least 6 more murders, experts believe. Glover was sentenced to 6 life sentences over the murders of 6 elderly women on Sydney's Lower North Shore between 1989 and 1990. Dubbed the Granny Killer, Glover hung himself in his cell at Lithgow Jail in September 2005 at the age of 72. His victims ranged from 60 to 92, and were attacked with a hammer, by Glover's fists or strangled with their pantyhose. Retired homicide detective Brian Collis appeared on Nine's Under Investigation program on Wednesday night, where he claimed it is highly likely Glover had many more victims. Mr. Collis said he has no doubt Glover was responsible for the deaths of 2 elderly women on the NSW Central Coast in 1984 and 1986. Years before his other murders. In 1984, Josephine McDonald, 73, was sexually assaulted and strangled in her Ettalong apartment. Wanda Munson, 80, was beaten with a hammer just a few kilometers away in Umina 2 years later. Glover would often travel to the Central Coast to visit his half-sister and his mother Frida, who was said to have had a complicated relationship with her son. The killer of those people, in my view, was John Wayne Glover, Detective Collis said. I have no doubt that was the case. The MO, the placing of the bodies, the method of death, all fitted in perfectly. But by the time police suspected Glover of the additional deaths, he was already serving a life sentence for the slaying of 6 elderly women in Sydney. The traveling pie salesman was 58 when he began that rampage, but experts believe he was a killer long before this. From 1957 to 1968, 4 elderly women were bashed and strangled to death in Victoria. Glover was high on the list of suspects as he had been living in Melbourne at the time, but he was never formally charged. His first confirmed victim was Gwendoline Mitchell-Hill, 82, in 1989. He had followed her back to her apartment in Neutral Bay and hit her multiple times in the head with a hammer in broad daylight. The snowy-haired killer would commit his second murder months later by bashing Lady Ashton, 84, with a hammer, before dragging her to a rubbish bin alcove, where he repeatedly hit her head on the concrete floor. He then removed her pantyhose and strangled her with them, positioned her shoes in walking stick near her lifeless body, and stole $100 from her purse. Lindsay Simpson, who interviewed Glover in Lithgow, speculated he may have been motivated to kill elderly women by the rage and hatred he felt for his own mother, Frida. The journalist told host Liz Hayes he had hated how promiscuous his mother had been when he was a young boy and disapproved of her dating several men. Miss Simpson said Glover had also stumbled across pornographic images of his mother, with the bodies of his victims later arranged just like the photographs. Following the death of his second victim was a string of attacks on elderly women in nursing homes and hospitals across the state. Traumatized women, who believed they had been molested, struggled to identify Glover, who was subsequently allowed to continue his cruel killing spree. His third victim was Margaret Pahad, 85, who was murdered on November 3, 1989. The widow was struck on the back of the head with a blunt object, with Glover rearranging her clothing, walking stick and shoes. Less than 24 hours later, the established granny killer struck again and murdered Olive Cleveland, 81, who he bashed and strangled with her pantyhose. With the $60 he took from Ms. Cleveland's purse, he paid a visit to the Mosman RSL to play the pokies. 3 weeks later, on November 23, 1989, his fourth victim, Muriel Falconer, who was partially deaf and blind from a recent stroke, was killed inside her home. He struck the elderly woman with a hammer and strangled her with her undergarments. The now recognizable MO of the killer, who was at that stage still unidentified. It was his final kill, that of his close friend Joan Sinclair, that finally led police to their man. Glover had been under 24-hour surveillance for some time, after witnesses described a portly, gray-haired man turning up at crime scenes and in nursing homes, where female residents had been molested. Tragically, officers watched as the practiced killer entered Ms. Sinclair's home, where he would just moments later end her life. The 60-year-old had recently installed security gates over widespread fears of the granny killer, but had inadvertently locked herself in with the murderer. After he killed his friend, Glover ran himself a bath, washed down a handful of Valium with alcohol, and slit his wrists. Police became suspicious when the pair failed to leave the home and were confronted with the grisly scene. Glover survived the suicide attempt. He had attempted to take his own life twice before, with his wife Gay Glover, describing a chilling moment when barely conscious. He told her half of him was good, while the other half was bad. He was sentenced to life in prison for the slaying of his 6 Sydney victims, and hanged himself in Lithgow on September 10, 2005. at the age of 72. Journalist Lindsay Simpson told the program in his final days, she never saw the murderer show any remorse for his victims, instead only feeling sorry for himself.
Number 7.
Among serial killers, Israel Keyes is an enigma. When police picked him up in Texas in March of 2012, it was for the murder of 18-year-old Samantha Koenig, whom he had brazenly kidnapped from a coffee stand in Anchorage, Alaska. Once in custody, however, he confessed to other murders and bank robberies and alluded to many more crimes. He ultimately claimed to have killed up to 11 victims between 2001 and 2012. But couldn't or wouldn't tell the authorities exactly when and where. He told them enough, however, for them to take him seriously. Then, in December 2012, after 9 months in custody, he killed himself, taking his secrets with him to the grave. Born in Richmond, Utah, on January 7, 1978, Israel Keyes was the second youngest of 10 siblings. His parents were Mormons who later became strict fundamentalist Christians that homeschooled their children and moved them around frequently. While living in Colville, Washington, the family attended a racist Christian identity church where, according to Salon, he befriended future white supremacist terrorists and murderers Chivy and Chain Cahoe, who were also his neighbors. Keyes would later tell investigators he was obsessed with guns as a boy and began to hunt anything with a heartbeat. As a teenager, he would break into people's homes and steal their firearms. He started to reject the Christian faith and flirted with Satanism, leading to a schism with his parents. Keyes' first crimes occurred during the summer of 1997, when he claimed he kidnapped and raped a teenage girl near the Deschutes River in Oregon. According to KTVZ, he lived in the nearby town of Maupin and said he lured the girl away from her friends. While she was inner tubing on the river, Keyes let the girl go after sexually assaulting her, and the crime was never reported. When Keyes was 20 years old, he got a high school equivalency degree and joined the U.S. Army. Over the next 2 years, he was stationed in Washington State, Texas, and Egypt. He made friends in the Army. Though friend Cern McGuire claimed he had a dark side and drank heavily, he was honorably discharged in 2001. While stationed at Washington's Fort Lewis Army Base, Keyes began a relationship with a woman who was a member of the Maca Indian tribe. She later gave birth to his daughter. After his discharge from the Army, they would move to the Maca Reservation in Nebe, Washington, where Keyes worked for the tribal authority. He intimated to investigators that he committed his first murder soon after moving there in 2001, because Nebe's a boring town. Keyes would later claim he committed 4 murders while living in Washington, though these crimes remain unconfirmed, and the identities of his alleged victims are unknown. He said one of his victims was bludgeoned to death, while another was dumped in nearby Lake Crescent. An FBI press release from 2013, which sought the public's assistance in substantiating his claims, stated that Keyes admitted killing an unidentified couple in Washington, but his details ended there. It is unknown if the victims were residents of Washington, tourists, or residents he abducted from a nearby state and transported to Washington. In March 2007, Keyes and his daughter moved to Anchorage, Alaska, to live with a woman he was dating. He worked as a handyman and contractor, and started his own business, Keyes Construction. He also visited various family members throughout the country and traveled internationally. The FBI determined he took as many as 35 trips between October 2004 and his capture in March 2012, and fear he claimed victims throughout his travels. Unlike other serial killers, Keyes had no victim type, killing both men and women of various ages, though he would later claim children and parents were off-limits. To avoid any connections, he targeted total strangers, traveling thousands of miles to stalk his victims and learn their habits before killing them. He funded these expeditions by robbing banks, including the April 2009 robbery of a bank in Tupper Lake, New York, 70 miles south of property he owned in the town of Constable. Keyes stashed murder kits near future crime scenes around the country that contained weapons and supplies to dispose of his victims' bodies. He would later tell investigators his preferred murder method was strangulation, so he could watch his victims suffer. Among the crimes law enforcement believes Keyes may be connected to is the disappearance of 49-year-old Deborah Feldman, who was last seen at her home in Hackensack, New Jersey. on April 8, 2009. After his arrest for the Koenig murder, Keyes told investigators he abducted a woman on the East Coast on April 9, 2009, and transported her to upstate New York, where he murdered and buried her. FBI Special Agent Barbara Woodruff would later tell CNN that when Keyes was shown a picture of Feldman, he paused and said, "I'm not ready to talk about that one." There has also been substantial internet chatter about the possibility of Keyes being involved with the 2004 disappearance of 21-year-old nursing student Maura Murray, who went missing after crashing her car in northern New Hampshire. Police, however, have denied any connection between the two crimes. In early June 2011, Keyes flew from Alaska to Chicago, then rented a car and drove to Essex, Vermont to look for victims. He had previously buried a murder kit nearby during a visit to the area in 2009, and he later told investigators he was looking for a house with an attached garage, no cars in the driveway, with no children and no dogs. Finally, after several days, he set his sights on Bill Currier, 50, and his wife Lorraine, 55. On the night of June 8, 2011, Keyes broke into the Currier's home, rushed to their bedroom and within seconds, had restrained them with zip ties. He then loaded them into their own car and drove them to a farmhouse he had previously scouted, where he planned to kill them. There, Lorraine Currier tried to make a break for it, but she was tackled and taken inside. When Bill Currier attempted to break free and rescue his wife, Keyes hit him in the head with a shovel and shot him. He then sexually assaulted Lorraine before strangling her. He claims he put their bodies in garbage bags and covered them with debris. The house was later demolished, and the couple's remains have never been found. He dumped the gun in a reservoir in Parrishville, New York, where it was eventually recovered by an FBI dive team. Keyes' most brazen crime was also the one that brought him down. On February 1, 2012, he kidnapped barista Samantha Koenig, 18, from the Common Grounds Espresso in Anchorage at gunpoint. He initially told her he was going to hold her for ransom, but after retrieving her cell phone and ATM card, he took her to a shed on his property, where he sexually assaulted her and strangled her to death. The following day, he left for a 2-week cruise that departed from New Orleans. Afterwards, he rented a car and drove through Texas, where he robbed a bank, set a home on fire, and, police suspect, killed another victim. Upon returning to Anchorage on February 17, Keyes sent a photograph where it appeared Koenig was still alive and demanded $30,000 ransom be placed in her bank account. Afterwards, he dismembered her body and disposed of it in Matanuska Lake north of Anchorage. Keyes once more hit the road, traveling to Arizona through New Mexico, before hitting Texas again, using Koenig's ATM card to make withdrawals all the way. Police were able to track his movements, and on March 13, 2012, he was apprehended in the parking lot of a Cotton Patch Cafe in Lufkin, Texas. Sometime after being extradited to Alaska, Keyes began talking, giving the FBI details of his crimes in bits and pieces. "There is no one who knows me, or who has ever known me, who knows anything about me, really," he told investigators. "They're going to tell you something that does not line up with anything I tell you, because I'm two different people, basically." Keyes was eventually forthcoming with details about the Currier and Koenig murders, but he held back from giving exact details of his other crimes. He was worried about the effect it would have on his daughter, saying, "I want her to have a chance to grow up and not have all of this hanging over her head." He would ultimately give 40 hours worth of interviews to investigators, but he never divulged the names of his other victims or dates of their murders. Keyes said he had studied the methods of fellow serial killer Ted Bundy, whom he admired, but called BTK killer Dennis Rader a wimp for professing remorse for his killings after he was caught. When asked why he committed his crimes, he reportedly replied, "Why not?" Regarding Keyes and killing, FBI Special Agent Jeanne Weber said, "He enjoyed it. He liked what he was doing. My whole issue is to keep control of it," Keyes had told investigators as they pressed him for details. On the night of December 1, 2012, Keyes took more control of his narrative, committing suicide with a piece of a razor he had hidden in a pencil, and using bedding material to strangle himself. Despite being previously held in a suicide cell, his suicide went undetected until the following morning. Following his death, the FBI went public with information about his possible connection to multiple unsolved murders and appealed for people to come forward with information. To date, Keyes' other alleged murders and crimes have yet to be confirmed. On December 10, 2012, Keyes' mother Heidi and 4 of his sisters convened in Deer Park, Washington, about an hour south of Colville where Israel grew up, for a small funeral service. They brought with them their pastor, Jake Gardner of the Church of Wells, from Wells, Texas, where most of Keyes' family now lives. He is not in a better place, Gardner said before the service began. He's in a place of eternal torment.
Number 8.
The family of a teenager suspected to have been a victim of the serial killer Fred West have expressed sadness that her remains have not been found after the basement of a Gloucester cafe was excavated by police. Relatives of 15-year-old Mary Bastholm, who vanished in 1968, said they still hope the mystery of what happened to her will one day be solved. Detectives investigated 6 voids in the basement floor of the Clean Plate Cafe in Gloucester after a television documentary team spotted what it believed to be blue material buried underground. When Mary went missing, she was wearing a blue coat and a blue and white dress and had a blue bag. But Gloucestershire Constabulary said on Thursday they had found no remains and nothing of interest to their inquiry after their operation, which has cost at least £50,000. They said blue coloration in an image passed to them by the documentary team was connected to a broken pipe, possibly caused when the television crew drilled into the floor. Martin Cuff, the crime scene coordinator, said the presence of a blue material was a key factor. It shaped part of the decisions for why we were going to perform this excavation. We haven't found anything we would describe as blue material consistent with an item of clothing. There is a possibility that the blue coloration that was seen might be the result of damage to one of the newer pipes that were installed. If you look at the center of them and shine a white light source on them, they do seem to give off a blue coloration. That seems consistent with the images taken by the production crew. The Assistant Chief Constable, Craig Holden, said, "Everyone working on this is disappointed that we didn't find Mary. Allowing her family to finally lay Mary to rest after over 50 years was always the most important reason for our excavation. I am now confident that Mary is not buried in the cellar of the cafe, and I hope that eliminating this location will bring some comfort, however small, to her family. I hope there is some consolation for local people. We have finally answered whether Mary's body was under a busy cafe in the center of Gloucester." He said he did not think there was any legal basis to seek costs from the television production company, adding, "Although, as a gesture of goodwill, if they were prepared to provide something, then that would be something we would need to discuss with them and, of course, the cafe owners." In a statement, Mary's family said, "We are still very sad that Mary has not been found. We were hoping to get a final closure on her disappearance so that we could put her to rest. We have been open-minded throughout this process, and we now know that the cafe can be ruled out. We can, however, hold out some hope that one day Mary will be found." Mary was a strong-willed and happy-go-lucky teenager, dearly loved by her parents and 2 brothers. She enjoyed life and was just coming into her own when her life was tragically cut short. Her parents and 2 brothers were never the same after she went missing. They have now sadly passed away without ever knowing what happened to their loving daughter and sister. West was previously suspected of killing Mary. Along with his wife, Rose West, he tortured, raped and murdered an unknown number of women over a 20-year period. West is said to have confessed to his son, Stephen, that he had killed Mary, but did not admit it to police. The girl's body was not found during the 1994 excavation of the West's home on Cromwell Street in Gloucester. West was charged with 12 murders, but took his own life in prison in 1995, aged 53, before his trial. Rose West was convicted of 10 murders in November 1995 and is serving a life sentence.
Number 9.
Even among other serial killers, Richard Chase, the vampire of Sacramento, was profoundly disturbed. Even from a very young age, he lived his life under a series of powerful delusions that had fatal consequences. Richard Chase ultimately became infamous when he killed and mutilated the bodies of 6 victims in Sacramento, California, in the late 1970s. Given his nickname, it doesn't come as much of a surprise that Richard Chase's trademark was drinking the blood of his victims after he killed them. But believe it or not, drinking his victims' blood wasn't even the vampire killer's most disturbing trait. Richard Chase showed signs of mental illness at a young age, but his father, a strict and sometimes physically abusive parent, did little to get him help. Chase was disturbed and unhappy as a child, and his symptoms grew worse in adolescence. He set several small fires, frequently wet the bed, and displayed signs of cruelty toward animals. These three habits are sometimes called the McDonald Triad, or the Triad of Sociopathy, proposed by psychiatrist J.M. MacDonald in 1963 as a predictor of sociopathy in a patient. Chase's problems grew worse when his father allegedly kicked him out of the house. Without supervision, Chase turned to alcohol and drugs, which quickly turned into substance abuse. Psychotropic drugs exacerbated the symptoms of his illness. Like the vampire whose moniker he would soon adopt, he became convinced on several occasions that his heart had stopped. At times, he thought he was a walking corpse. But being occasionally dead was no reason to neglect his health. Fearing that he lacked vitamin C, he reportedly pressed whole oranges to the skin of his forehead, believing that his brain would absorb the nutrients directly. One of his strangest and most powerful delusions involved his skull. He felt that his cranial bones had split apart and begun to shift beneath his skin, changing places and jumbling like puzzle pieces. He shaved his head in an effort to monitor their movements. Unsurprisingly, at the age of 25, Chase was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and institutionalized in 1975. To prevent him from becoming a danger to himself. His fascination with blood earned him the nickname Dracula among the psychiatric hospital's assistants, who witnessed him kill and attempt to drink the blood of several birds, in an effort to stave off the effects, a poison that was, he imagined, slowly turning his own blood to powder. It was his attempt to inject himself with rabbit's blood, which made him violently ill, that had resulted in his institutionalization. In spite of several similar incidents, the staff believed that they had rehabilitated Chase, and he was released to live with his mother. It was a fatal decision, as Chase's condition wasn't improving, he was growing worse. Though Richard Chase had been released into his mother's care, there was nothing legally binding that forced him to stay with her. Not long after his release from the psychiatric hospital, he moved out, later saying he thought his mother was poisoning him. He moved into an apartment he shared with a group of young men he called friends. But it seems they didn't know Chase well, and when he persisted in unusual behavior, notably drug abuse that left him constantly high, and a proclivity for walking around the apartment without any clothing, they asked him to leave. Richard Chase, however, refused, and it seemed the path of least resistance to his sometime roommates to abandon the apartment and find other lodgings. Chase was once again living on his own, a circumstance that almost always exacerbated the symptoms of his condition. His fascination with blood resurfaced, and he began capturing and killing small animals. He would eat them raw or blend their organs with soda and drink the mixture. In August of 1977, Nevada police found him late one night in the Lake Tahoe area, covered in blood and carrying a bucket with a liver in the back of his pickup. Since they determined the blood and organ belonged to a cow, not a human, they let Chase go. Yet again, Richard Chase slipped through the cracks in systems that could have helped him and protected others. As it was, alone, with no one to watch him or rein him in, he fell more deeply under the power of his delusions, until finally they prompted him to do the unthinkable. On December 29, 1977, Richard Chase was frustrated and lonely. His mother hadn't allowed him to come home for Christmas, he would later recall, and he was mad. Ambrose Griffin, a 51-year-old man who was helping his wife bring in groceries, became his first victim. While driving by their street, Chase pulled out a .22 caliber pistol and shot him in the chest. It was the beginning of an obsession. On January 23, 1978, Chase entered the home of Teresa Wallen, who was pregnant, through her unlocked front door. He felt, he would say during interrogation, that an unlocked door was a kind of invitation to him, a justification for what happened next. From that time on, all his victims were people who had left their door unlocked. Richard Chase shot Teresa Wallen 3 times using the same gun he used to shoot Griffin. Chase proceeded to stab her with a butcher knife, Before cutting out her organs and drinking her blood, he reportedly used a yogurt container as a cup. Chase's final murders were the most gruesome of all. On January 27, 1978, just 4 days after Wallen's murder, Chase found Evelyn Meredith's door unlocked. Inside were her 6-year-old son Jason Meredith, her 22-month-old nephew David Ferreira, and a friend named Dan Meredith. Meredith was murdered in the hallway, dead by a gunshot wound to the head. Chase subsequently stole his car keys. Evelyn and Jason were found in Evelyn's bedroom. The little boy had been shot twice in the head. Evelyn was partially cannibalized. Her stomach was cut open, and she had multiple organs missing. There was also a failed attempt to remove one of her eyes, and her corpse had been sodomized. The baby, David Ferreira, whom Evelyn Meredith had been babysitting, was missing from the scene of the crime. The child's decapitated corpse was found months later behind a church. The story of what happened that night emerged during Chase's trial. The knock of a visitor had startled Sacramento's vampire killer, who took Ferreira's body and fled via Meredith's stolen car. The visitor alerted a neighbor, who then called the cops. The authorities were able to identify Chase's prints in Meredith's blood. When the police searched Chase's apartment, they found that all of his utensils were stained with blood, and his fridge contained human brains. Chase was arrested. The sensational trial of the vampire of Sacramento began on January 2, 1979, and lasted 5 months. The defense attorneys rejected the suggested death penalty on the grounds that Chase was not guilty by reason of insanity. In the end, after 5 hours of deliberation, the jury took the side of the prosecution. Richard Chase, the vampire killer, was found guilty of 6 counts of murder and sentenced to death by gas chamber. His fellow inmates, aware of his crimes, were frightened by him. They often encouraged him to kill himself. Richard Chase did just that, stockpiling the anti-anxiety medicine he was offered by the jail staff until he had enough for a fatal overdose. He was found dead in his jail cell the day after Christmas in 1980.
Number 10.
Javed Iqbal was a Pakistani serial killer who was responsible for the deaths of at least 100 young boys, ranging in age from 6 to 16. His method of killing was particularly gruesome, as he would strangle his victims, dismember the corpses, and then dissolve them in acid in order to destroy the evidence. His case attracted national attention in Pakistan, and his sentence was similar to what he did to his victims. In 2000, he was found guilty and sentenced to death in the same manner that he killed the boys, being strangled first and cut into 100 pieces in front of the victims' families, and then dissolved into acid. However, before the sentence could be carried out, Iqbal committed suicide inside his cell. At one point, Iqbal stated that his killings were in revenge for the brutal punishment he received at the hands of the police after his arrest in the past. Little is known about the early life of Javed Iqbal, born in 1956. Although some sources suggest 1961 as his birth year, he was the 6th of 8 children in a businessman's family. He attended Government Islamia College in Railway Road, Lahore, as an intermediate student, and lived in a villa his father had purchased for him. To lure children, Iqbal opened a video game shop in Shadba, the first of its kind. He offered tokens to young boys at reduced rates, and sometimes did not charge them at all. He then used this opportunity to manipulate the boys by throwing a 100 rupee note on the floor and observing the child who picked it up. He would then falsely accuse them of stealing his money and search them even though he already knew the guilty party. The boy who picked up the note would be caught and taken to the adjacent room, where Iqbal would sexually abuse the boy. At times, Iqbal would later give the money back to the boy as a gesture of goodwill. However, soon the locals stopped sending their children to visit the shop. In response, Iqbal set up a fish aquarium and later a gym, both as a means to lure young boys. Javed Iqbal, a man from Lahore, committed a heinous crime by targeting poor orphans and runaway boys. He would take these boys to his home in Lahore, where he would rape and strangle them to death. He would then dismember their bodies, cut them into smaller pieces, and dissolve the remains in hydrochloric acid to eliminate any trace of the murder and leave no evidence behind. If any remains were left, He would throw them in the river nearby his house. But why did a man from Lahore decide to kill 100 children? Javed Iqbal's motive for committing these murders was his infuriation at a perceived injustice at the hands of Lahore police, who had arrested him on charges relating to rape against a young runaway boy in the 1990s, when he was in his early 20s. According to Iqbal, he was not associated with any of the charges, and he was forcefully arrested. His mother tried everything to get him out, but was unsuccessful and suffered a fatal heart attack in the process. Javed Iqbal resolved to make 100 mothers cry for their sons, as his mother had been forced to do before her death. In December 1999, Javed Iqbal decided to confess and sent letters to the police and a local newspaper. He confessed to the rape and murder of 100 runaway boys, all aged between 6 and 16 years. In the letter, he detailed records of everything he had done. He claimed to have strangled and dismembered his victims, and then disposed of their bodies using vats of hydrochloric acid, and dumped any remains in a local river. He also confessed that he had planned to drown himself in the Ravi River, but was unable to do so. This led to the biggest manhunt in Pakistan. Police found Iqbal's house, and once inside they found bloodstains on the walls and floor. They also found the chain that Iqbal used to strangle children and children's photographs in plastic bags, neatly labeled with handwritten pamphlets. Iqbal also left 2 vats of acid with partially dissolved human remains in an open place for the police to find, with a note claiming that the bodies had been deliberately left in the house, so that the authorities could find them. 4 accomplices who shared Iqbal's villa were arrested, and within days, one of them died in police custody. A 17-year-old boy was sentenced to death, and 2 other men accused in the case were jailed for 14 years. Despite the biggest manhunt in which dozens of people were detained, Iqbal escaped the police for many days. However, in December 1999, he walked into a newspaper office to give himself up. "I am Javed Iqbal, killer of 100 children." He told the staff, "I hate this world. I am not ashamed of my actions, and I am ready to die. I have no regrets. I killed 100 children. I could have killed 500. This was not the problem. Money was not a problem. But the pledge I had taken was of 100 children, and I never wanted to violate this." Iqbal said that he surrendered at a newspaper office because he feared for his life and was concerned about what the police would do to him. He produced a 32-page diary dealing with his sexual abuse and murder of the victims, and including the children's photographs. The judge in the case, Alberto, told the court in Lahore, "Javed Iqbal has been found guilty of 100 murders. The sentence is that he should be strangled 100 times. His body should be cut into 100 pieces and put in acid, as he did with his victims." A few days after his sentence, he withdrew his confession and pleaded not guilty, stating that he had invented his story to highlight the problems of runaway children. On October 8, 2001, Javed Iqbal was found hanging in his cell before the execution could be carried out, and his young accomplice was also found hanged in a nearby cell the same night. Despite indications of foul play, their deaths were officially ruled as suicides. One of the prison guards saw Iqbal and his accomplice Sajid hanging with bedsheets tied to the iron bars of the cell when he woke up. The doctor in the mortuary said that strangulation marks were found around the blood-splashed necks of the 2 prisoners. They were bleeding from the mouth and nostrils. They added, an injury mark was found around Sajid's neck, and countless healed wounds inflicted with a blunt weapon were also found all over the body of Javed Iqbal. No one from Javed Iqbal's family came to collect his body. "We have nothing to do with him. He died for us on the day he confessed to killing 100 children," said his family members. Netflix released the movie Javed Iqbal, the untold story of a serial killer, based on the life of the notorious Pakistani serial killer and sex offender. Now that you've read about Pakistani serial killer Javed Iqbal, read about Aku Yadav, who was given justice by his victims.